The highway stretched endlessly before me, a dark ribbon slicing through the night. It had been hours since I'd seen another car, and the quiet solitude of the road had begun to feel oppressive. When the glowing lights of a gas station appeared on the horizon, they seemed like an oasis in the void. I pulled in, the tires crunching softly on the gravel lot. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their cold glow illuminating an otherwise desolate scene. The station looked functional but worn, its paint faded and the sign advertising fuel prices barely legible. The door to the convenience store was slightly ajar, swinging faintly in the breeze, but no one was inside. I hesitated for a moment, glancing around the lot. There was no attendant in sight, no movement beyond the pale glow of the station's lights. Still, the pumps were operational, so I swiped my card and began refueling. The silence was unnerving. No traffic passed by on the highway, and the faint hum of the lights was the only sound breaking the stillness. As I leaned against my car, waiting for the tank to fill, a faint chill ran down my spine. Something about the place felt wrong, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I glanced toward the tree line on the edge of the lot, the dense forest beyond seeming to press inward, as though the darkness itself was watching. As the pump clicked, signaling that the tank was full, something on the ground caught my eye. A faint, dark streak led away from the station, the trail winding toward the forest. At first, I thought it might be spilled oil or some other debris, but as I crouched down for a closer look, I realized it was something else entirely. The trail was a smear of dark red, unmistakably blood. My first instinct was to ignore it. Whatever had caused the trail wasn't my business. But the longer I stared at it, the harder it became to look away. The streaks were faint but deliberate, as if someone had been dragged or stumbled away from the station. My gaze followed the trail as it disappeared into the dense forest beyond, the trees standing like silent sentinels guarding its path. I debated with myself, torn between the fear of what I might find and the nagging sense of responsibility to help if someone was hurt. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight from the car and stepped toward the forest. The trail was clearer up close, the blood glistening faintly under the beam of light. My stomach twisted as I moved closer to the tree line, the soft crunch of gravel beneath my feet giving way to the muffled rustle of leaves. The forest swallowed me almost immediately, its darkness pressing in on all sides. The flashlight's beam carved a narrow path ahead, illuminating the blood trail as it wound deeper into the trees. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, each step stirring the silence that hung heavy in the night. As I ventured further, I began to notice torn pieces of fabric scattered along the trail. The first shred of clothing was small, barely distinguishable in the beam of my flashlight. It clung to a low-hanging branch, frayed edges swaying faintly in the night breeze. Further along, I found another piece, this one larger and stained dark with what I assumed was more blood. The trail became more sporadic, as though whatever had left it was slowing down, losing momentum. My pulse quickened as I tried to imagine what could have caused this, the scenarios in my mind growing darker with each step. The forest seemed to close in around me, its quiet no longer feeling passive but deliberate, as though the trees themselves were watching. Every snap of a twig beneath my feet echoed too loudly, and the rustle of leaves overhead felt unnaturally sharp, like something unseen was moving in tandem with me. My breath hitched as I glanced around, the shadows between the trees seeming to shift and deepen, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. It wasn't until I reached a small clearing that I noticed them. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, dark shapes just at the edge of my vision, motionless against the backdrop of the trees. But as I stood frozen, my flashlight trembling in my hand, I realized the figures were real. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel their presence, heavy and unyielding, like an oppressive weight pressing down on my chest. I tried to focus the beam of light on one of them, but as soon as the light touched the figure, it seemed to dissolve into the shadows, leaving no trace behind. My heart pounded as I swung the flashlight around, catching fleeting glimpses of the others, each one disappearing as soon as the light hit them. They were close, but never too close, lingering just far enough away to remain undefined, their silhouettes blending seamlessly with the surrounding trees. The realization that I wasn't alone sent a surge of fear through me. Whatever these figures were, they weren't acting like people. They didn't move toward me, didn't speak or make a sound. They simply watched, their presence unrelenting and suffocating. The forest, which had already felt oppressive, now felt like a trap, the path I'd taken suddenly seeming impossibly far away. I turned back, my hands trembling as I tried to retrace my steps, the figures following silently, always at the edge of the light. As I retraced my steps, the forest felt different, as though it had shifted in some imperceptible way. The path I'd followed earlier now seemed narrower, the trees closer together, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The figures were still there, always at the edges of my vision, slipping in and out of the shadows. I kept my flashlight trained ahead, refusing to look back, determined to reach the gas station and put this nightmare behind me. Then I heard it, footsteps. At first they were faint, almost imperceptible, but as I continued walking, they grew louder, more deliberate. They didn't match my own, their rhythm erratic, sometimes speeding up, sometimes slowing down. I froze in place, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart, and the footsteps stopped, too. The silence that followed was deafening, oppressive, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I turned my flashlight toward the source of the sound, but the beam revealed nothing but empty forest. Yet the moment I started walking again, the footsteps resumed, closer now, as though whatever was following me had grown bolder. My pace quickened, each step feeling heavier than the last, and the footsteps mirrored mine, their presence growing louder, more insistent. Panic surged through me, my breathing shallow as I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, some harmless creature wandering the woods. But deep down, I knew better. The footsteps were too close now, their sound breaking through every attempt to rationalize. They weren't just following me, they were closing in. My fear reached a breaking point, and I broke into a sprint, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I ran. The forest blurred around me, the trees melting into a wall of darkness that seemed to press closer with every step. The air felt thick, pulling at my limbs like an invisible force trying to slow me down. The figures in the trees shifted as I ran, their silhouettes flickering like shadows cast by an unseen fire. They didn't follow, didn't move toward me, but their presence was everywhere, surrounding me, watching. I couldn't focus on them. All I could think about was reaching the gas station, the distant glow of its fluorescent lights a beacon in the overwhelming darkness. My chest burned, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed myself forward, refusing to look back. The footsteps grew chaotic, no longer matching my own but overlapping, echoing around me as though coming from every direction. Twigs snapped underfoot, and the rustle of leaves sounded like whispers, a low murmur that seemed to rise and fall with my frantic movements. I stumbled once, nearly falling, but managed to catch myself, the flashlight tumbling from my grip and landing in the dirt. I snatched it up and kept running, the beam slicing through the darkness as I willed my legs to keep moving. When I finally burst from the tree line, the sight of the gas station felt like salvation. Its lights glowed faintly in the distance, their flicker almost mocking in their steadiness. My car sat where I'd left it, the familiar shape a stark contrast to the chaotic nightmare of the forest. I sprinted toward it, my muscles screaming in protest, the sense of pursuit pressing down on me like a physical weight. I reached the car and yanked the door open, throwing myself inside and slamming it shut. My hands trembled as I locked the doors, my fingers fumbling with the keys as I tried to start the engine. The gas station seemed eerily silent now, the humming of the fluorescent lights the only sound breaking the oppressive quiet. I glanced toward the tree line, half expecting to see the figures emerging, but the forest stood still, its darkness impenetrable. The engine roared to life, and I didn't hesitate. I threw the car into gear and sped away from the gas station, gravel flying as the tires skidded against the lot. The lights of the station quickly disappeared into the rearview mirror, swallowed by the endless stretch of dark highway. My breathing was shallow, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. The only thought in my mind was to get as far away as possible. Volunteering at the animal shelter, felt like the perfect opportunity to do something meaningful. I'd always loved animals, and spending a few hours a week helping out seemed like a way to balance the monotony of my day job. The shelter itself was a modest, nondescript building on the edge of town. Its plain exterior belied the warmth within. Rows of kennels filled with wagging tails and soft meows, and a staff that, at first glance, seemed dedicated and friendly. On my first day, I was paired with a supervisor named Carol, a no-nonsense woman who showed me the ropes. She explained the daily routines: cleaning kennels, feeding the animals, and assisting visitors looking to adopt. It was straightforward enough, and I settled into the rhythm quickly. The staff were polite but distant, their smiles thin and formal, as if they were guarding something beneath the surface. I brushed it off, assuming they were simply overworked. Still, there were small things that didn't sit right. Certain areas were always locked, and the staff made a point of steering me away from them. Whenever I asked about those spaces, the answers were vague: storage, medical quarantine, or not your responsibility. I noticed that the staff seemed unusually tense, especially when the phone rang or someone arrived unannounced. At first I thought I was imagining it, but the more I observed, the harder it was to ignore. A few weeks in, I began noticing oddities that I couldn't explain away. While organizing supplies in the storage room, I came across a shipment of medical equipment: large syringes, vials labeled with scientific terms I didn't recognize, and surgical tools. It seemed far too advanced for a simple shelter. When I asked Carol about it, she brushed me off with a curt, "It's for emergencies," before quickly locking the cabinet. Another time, while filing adoption records, I noticed discrepancies in the logs. Several animals were marked as transferred, but the destinations were listed only as vague initials. When I asked about it, one of the staff members shot me a sharp look, muttering something about paperwork errors, before snatching the file from my hands. The strangest discovery came one evening while I was cleaning. I found a stack of unmarked crates in a locked room someone had forgotten to secure. They were heavy, sealed tight, and reeked of something metallic and sour. The smell turned my stomach, and when I asked the night shift supervisor about it, his face went pale. He told me, in no uncertain terms, to leave it alone. The incident stuck with me, the uneasy feeling growing stronger with each passing day. The shelter's routine began to feel like a facade, a carefully constructed illusion hiding something far more sinister. I started paying closer attention, piecing together the strange occurrences. Late at night, unmarked vans would pull into the parking lot, their drivers unloading crates and supplies that were hurriedly taken inside. The animals involved in these transfers were always among the healthiest and friendliest, disappearing without a trace. They were never put up for adoption, and any mention of them in records seemed to vanish. The staff grew more secretive as I noticed these patterns. Whispers behind closed doors would stop abruptly when I entered a room. The smiles they once offered me were replaced with wary glances and stiff politeness. I overheard fragments of conversations, words like shipment, buyers, and schedule, but never enough to piece together the full picture. My suspicions were no longer just idle curiosity. They had become a gnawing certainty that the shelter wasn't what it seemed. Despite my growing fear, I couldn't stop myself from digging deeper. The thought of animals being mistreated, or worse, consumed me. But the more I uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't a simple matter of neglect. Whatever was happening here was deliberate, organized, and far beyond my understanding. One evening, unable to shake my suspicions, I decided to take a risk. After my shift ended, I stayed behind, hiding in a supply closet until the staff locked up and left for the night. My heart pounded as I crept through the dimly lit halls, flashlight in hand, heading toward the locked areas I'd been forbidden to enter. The keys I'd swiped earlier from an unsuspecting supervisor jingled faintly in my pocket, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence. The first door I unlocked led to a room filled with stacked crates, similar to the ones I'd seen before. But now I had time to examine them closely. Each crate was labeled with cryptic codes, none of which made sense. I pried one open, and my stomach churned at the sight inside. A small dog, unconscious but breathing shallowly, its fur matted with dried blood. Nearby crates contained more animals, all in varying states of sedation or distress. On a desk in the corner, I found stacks of papers, inventory lists, invoices, and emails that hinted at transactions with vague buyers in far-off locations. Words like specimens, transport, and research were scrawled in the margins, along with dollar amounts that made my blood run cold. Whatever this operation was, it wasn't just about animals. It was something far darker. As I rifled through the documents, a noise from down the hall froze me in place. Footsteps. My pulse thundered in my ears as I scrambled to put everything back, shoving the papers into a folder and sliding it under my jacket. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, and I slipped out the back door just as the lock on the main entrance clicked open. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands shaking so badly that I struggled to get the keys into the ignition. The next morning, I arrived at the shelter, determined to keep my discovery a secret. My mind raced as I replayed the events of the night before, trying to decide what to do next. I had the documents hidden at home, proof of the shelter's illegal activities, but I was terrified of what might happen if I shared them. The staff were already acting more tense than usual, their whispers more frequent, their eyes lingering on me longer than they should. By midday, I was certain they knew. Carol called me into her office, her demeanor colder than I'd ever seen. She wasted no time in getting to the point. "We've noticed you've been asking a lot of questions," she said, her tone sharp. "That's not your job. Stick to the animals and leave the rest to us." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Before I could respond, another staff member entered the room, closing the door firmly behind them. "We know you were here last night," they said, their voice low and threatening. "If you know what's good for you, you'll forget whatever you think you saw." The conversation ended abruptly, but their message was clear. As I walked back to the kennels, I felt their eyes on me, watching my every move. That evening, as I left the shelter, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper. "Stay out of it." My hands shook as I read the words, my fear mounting. They knew I had seen too much, and now they wanted to make sure I stayed silent. For the next few days, I couldn't focus on anything but the threats. At home, I kept the folder hidden, paranoid that someone might find it. I started noticing strange things. A car parked outside my house for hours at a time, the feeling of being followed when I went out. My phone rang constantly, but the calls were always from unknown numbers, the line silent when I answered. One night, I returned home to find my front door slightly ajar. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. The house seemed untouched, but when I checked my hiding spot, the folder was gone. In its place was another note, written in the same sharp handwriting as before. "We don't warn twice." That was the moment I realized the full extent of their reach. They weren't just threatening me, they were showing me how easily they could dismantle my life if I didn't comply. My mind raced with questions. How long had they been watching me? Did they know more about me than I thought? The fear became suffocating, and I knew I couldn't stay any longer. Leaving felt like my only option. I couldn't go to the police. The shelter clearly had connections, and I had no way of knowing how far their influence extended. Quietly, I began making preparations to leave the city. I packed my essentials, taking care not to draw attention to myself. Each trip to my car felt like a risk, every movement shadowed by the fear that someone might be watching. I told no one about my plans, offering vague excuses to friends and family about needing a change. I resigned from the shelter with as little fanfare as possible, avoiding eye contact during my last shift. The staff's reactions were unreadable. No smiles, no goodbyes, just a palpable tension that hung in the air as I walked out for the final time. The bus had become an integral part of my daily rhythm. Every morning I stepped onto the same vehicle at the same time, sinking into the familiarity of its routine. The hum of the engine, the shuffle of passengers finding seats, and the quiet monotony of the ride were oddly comforting. I had my spot, a window seat 3 rows from the back, away from the chatter of students or the occasional commuter on a phone call. That morning began no differently. I boarded the bus, found my usual seat, and stared out at the city rushing by. As the stops passed, I noticed someone new, a man sitting near the middle, facing directly toward me. He didn't glance out the window or check his phone like the others. Instead, his gaze was fixed, unblinking, as if he were studying me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was lost in thought, and I just happened to be in his line of sight. I shifted slightly, looking away to avoid any awkwardness. When I glanced back, his eyes were still on me. A faint prickling sensation ran along my skin, but I shook it off, chalking it up to paranoia. By the time my stop arrived, the man hadn't moved. I stepped off the bus, and for the rest of the day, I forgot about the encounter entirely. The next morning, I saw him again. Same bus, same time, same seat. His posture was relaxed, yet his eyes were sharp, locked onto me like a hawk tracking its prey. I felt the unease creeping back, but tried to brush it off as coincidence. Maybe he was a regular commuter I just hadn't noticed before. But the pattern repeated. Every day that week, he was there. Silent, unmoving, always staring. I started to question myself. Was he truly looking at me, or was I overanalyzing a harmless situation? I tested the theory by changing seats, moving closer to the front of the bus. When I glanced back, he had shifted his position slightly to maintain his line of sight. That subtle adjustment made my chest tighten. This wasn't my imagination. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The ride began to feel oppressive, the air heavier each time I boarded. I'd tell myself it didn't matter, that he was probably just some eccentric stranger. But each glance over my shoulder confirmed that his attention hadn't wavered. By Friday, the man's presence was unbearable. His gaze had grown more intense, no longer passive or distant. It was deliberate. His eyes never wavered, following me as I boarded and sat down. My usual strategies, pretending to read, staring out the window, did nothing to ease the tension. I couldn't stop glancing in his direction, waiting for some kind of reaction, some sign of intent. When the bus jolted to a stop, he leaned forward slightly, the motion subtle yet unnervingly focused. A knot formed in my stomach, and my thoughts spiraled into worst-case scenarios. Was he following me? Planning something? The rational part of me tried to dismiss it, but the weight of his stare made it impossible. As my stop approached, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to stay on the bus to see if he would leave without me. But the idea of extending the ride trapped in that confined space felt worse. When the doors opened, I hurried off, not daring to look back until I was far down the street. That evening, the bus was emptier than usual. I scanned the seats, hoping the man wouldn't be there. For a moment, I felt relief. His seat was empty. But just as the doors were closing, he stepped on, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he knew I'd been looking for him. I stared straight ahead, willing myself to ignore him. The bus ride stretched endlessly, every stop dragging me closer to home and further into dread. When my stop arrived, I moved quickly, stepping off without looking back. But as I walked toward my building, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. Turning my head, I saw him. He was following me, his pace measured but deliberate, the same intensity in his eyes now mirrored in his movements. I quickened my pace, weaving through the crowd of pedestrians. When I glanced back again, he was closer. My heart raced as I broke into a brisk walk, trying to lose him in the maze of streets. Each turn, each shortcut I took, seemed futile. He was relentless, his figure growing larger and more defined every time I glanced over my shoulder. The chase had begun, and I was running out of places to hide. The streets were growing quieter as the evening deepened. I turned into an alley, hoping to shake him, but his footsteps echoed steadily behind me. The sound was unmistakable, deliberate, heavy, and unhurried, like he wasn't concerned about losing me. I forced myself to stay calm, taking sharp turns and weaving through side streets. My breathing grew labored as I tried to maintain my pace without breaking into a full sprint. Each time I glanced back, his figure loomed closer, his strides determined and unrelenting. I pushed through a narrow passageway between two buildings, my shoulder brushing against the rough brick. The passage opened into another alley, but it was empty, desolate. For a fleeting moment, I thought I might have lost him. I ducked behind a dumpster, pressing myself against the cold metal, straining to hear his footsteps. There was a pause, an unnerving silence. Then faintly, the sound of shoes scuffing against pavement. He was close. I held my breath, my pulse hammering in my ears as I tried to disappear into the shadows. The sound grew louder. His pace quickened, each step resonating like a drumbeat in the hollow alleyway. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to be invisible. Just as his steps reached the edge of the dumpster, they stopped. I heard him exhale sharply, muttering something under his breath. He lingered for a moment, so close I could hear the rustle of his clothes. Then, his footsteps started again, fading into the distance. I didn't dare move. The stench of rotting garbage filled the air as I crouched in the shadows, waiting for what felt like an eternity. My legs ached, and my chest burned from holding my breath, but I couldn't risk moving. Every small noise, a distant car, the creak of a window, made me flinch. I waited until the alley was completely silent before daring to peek around the edge of the dumpster. The street beyond was empty, the orange glow of the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows. My mind raced as I tried to piece together what had just happened. Who was he? What did he want? The thought of his unblinking stare sent a shiver through me. I couldn't stay here, but the idea of stepping back onto the open street felt equally dangerous. Gathering my courage, I crept along the alley wall, keeping to the shadows. My shoes scraped against the pavement, and I winced at every sound. The fear of him doubling back kept me glancing over my shoulder, my paranoia building with each step. At the edge of the alley, I paused, scanning the street for any sign of him. It was clear, but the tension in my chest didn't ease. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still nearby, watching, waiting. I forced myself to keep moving, taking the longest, most convoluted route I could think of back to my apartment. I avoided the main roads, sticking to alleys and side streets, doubling back several times to ensure I wasn't being followed. Every noise felt amplified in the stillness of the night. The distant bark of a dog, the hum of a streetlight, even the sound of my own footsteps made me jump. I couldn't tell if my fear was playing tricks on me or if he was truly somewhere close, just out of sight. When I finally reached my building, I hesitated at the door, scanning the street one last time. It was empty, but the oppressive weight of his presence still lingered. My hands trembled as I fumbled with my keys, slipping inside and locking the door behind me with a sharp click. Inside, the familiar walls of my apartment didn't bring the comfort I'd hoped for. I checked every room, every closet, even under the bed, making sure I was alone. Only when I was certain did I collapse onto the couch, my body shaking with exhaustion and relief. The school stood at the edge of town, hidden behind overgrown trees and rusted fences. Its silhouette loomed against the twilight sky, a skeletal structure long abandoned to time. I had passed by it many times, each glance pulling me closer to its mystery. Today, curiosity had won out. I slipped through a gap in the fence, stepping into the grounds littered with crumbling bricks and shattered glass. The building's facade was a mosaic of decay, boarded-up windows, graffiti-scrawled walls, and vines creeping like veins across its surface. A rusted sign above the entrance still bore the faint outline of its name, though the letters were faded beyond recognition. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and dust. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating long hallways lined with empty lockers. Each step echoed unnervingly, the sound bouncing off the hollow walls. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I wandered through the classrooms, marveling at how time had frozen this place. Broken desks were scattered haphazardly, chalkboards still held faded lessons, and crumpled papers lay forgotten on the floor. A faint sense of unease lingered at the edges of my mind, but I brushed it aside. It was just an empty building, I told myself, a relic of the past, abandoned and harmless. Or so I thought. As I ventured deeper into the school, the atmosphere began to shift. At first, it was subtle, small things that felt out of place. In one hallway, I noticed scuff marks on the dusty floor, as though something heavy had been dragged recently. I followed them, my curiosity piqued, but they disappeared at a corner. Inside one classroom, a chair sat upright in the center of the room. It was unsettling in its placement, perfectly aligned and seemingly untouched by the decay around it. My eyes darted to the floor, where the dust had been disturbed, forming faint but distinct footprints leading to the doorway. My heart quickened as I spotted a candy wrapper on the ground, its colors bright and unblemished. It looked new, too new to belong in a place that had been abandoned for years. I crouched to inspect it, but a distant creak pulled my attention back to the hallway. I turned sharply, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam revealed nothing but the empty corridor. Yet, the feeling that I wasn't alone had begun to creep in, settling deep in my chest. In one of the larger classrooms, I paused to catch my breath. The weight of the building's silence pressed down on me, and my nerves were starting to fray. I scanned the room with my flashlight, noting the remnants of a projector and overturned chairs. Then, as I turned toward the doorway, I froze. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of my light. It was tall, its form blurred by the shadows, but unmistakably there. My first instinct was to dismiss it as a trick of the dim light or my overactive imagination. I flicked my flashlight off and on again, but the figure remained. It didn't move. It didn't react. It simply stood there, watching. A chill ran through me as I took a step back, my flashlight's beam shaking as I tried to focus on the figure. Just as I was about to speak, though what I would have said I didn't know, the figure shifted slightly, its outline becoming more defined. I stumbled out of the room and into the hallway, but when I looked again, it was gone. The hallway was empty. Still, the oppressive feeling of being watched clung to me like a second skin. I wanted to leave, but my pride, or perhaps my curiosity, kept me moving forward. Still, the unease was growing harder to ignore. Every sound, every shadow seemed to carry a hidden threat. The figure's absence was worse than its presence. The uncertainty gnawed at me. I made my way toward the staircase that led to the upper floors. As I reached the landing, my flashlight flickered briefly, plunging the space into momentary darkness. When the light steadied, my heart nearly stopped. The figure was there again, standing at the far end of the stairwell. It hadn't moved closer, but its presence was suffocating. I gripped the railing tightly, debating whether to turn back, but the idea of passing by it again was unbearable. I continued upward, my steps quickening as I reached the next floor. The hallways here were narrower, the air colder. My flashlight revealed faded murals on the walls, children's drawings that felt unnervingly out of place in this decaying tomb. Then, the faintest sound, a shuffle, almost imperceptible, echoed from behind me. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping over the corridor, but it revealed nothing. The shadows seemed thicker now, pressing in from all sides. I wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched had grown unbearable. My every step was cautious, deliberate, as though I could outmaneuver the presence I knew was there. I tried to rationalize it, tricks of the light, the natural eeriness of an abandoned place. But deep down, I knew better. As I made my way toward the exit, I felt it again. The figure was behind me. I didn't need to turn around to confirm it. I could feel its weight, the oppressive energy of its gaze boring into my back. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls that seemed to shift and writhe. The hallways felt endless, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. Each time I thought I was nearing the exit, I found myself in another corridor or empty classroom. It was as if the building itself was conspiring to keep me inside. At one point, I glanced back, unable to resist any longer. The figure was there, standing in the middle of the hallway, motionless yet undeniably closer than before. It wasn't advancing, but its presence felt like a silent command. Keep moving. I broke into a run, my breath ragged and echoing in the stale air. The sound of my own footsteps drowned out everything else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that another pair of feet was trailing just behind. The school's entrance was in sight, but the corridor leading to it felt longer than I remembered. My flashlight sputtered again, plunging the hallway into darkness. I froze, unable to see anything, the silence pressing in like a living thing. Then I heard it, a loud, deliberate creak, like weight shifting on old wood. It was behind me. I didn't wait for the light to stabilize. Blindly, I pushed forward, my hands skimming the walls for guidance. The air felt colder, and the sound of faint, measured footsteps filled the space around me. When the flashlight finally flickered back on, I turned instinctively, and my heart lurched. The figure was no more than a few yards away now, its silhouette sharp and imposing in the beam's dim glow. It still didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, as if it were willing me to stay. I stumbled backward, nearly falling as I reached the door. My trembling hands fumbled with the latch, but the mechanism was stiff, rusted with age. My panic grew as I felt the space behind me shrink, the weight of the figure's proximity pressing down like a physical force. With a desperate shove, the door creaked open, spilling me into the cool night air. I slammed it shut behind me, leaning against it as I gasped for breath. The silence outside was deafening, but it felt like freedom compared to the oppressive stillness inside. The school loomed behind me, a hulking silhouette against the night sky. I didn't look back as I staggered toward the fence, my legs weak and unsteady. The grass and broken pavement blurred beneath my feet, my only thought to put as much distance between myself and that building as possible. But just as I reached the gap in the fence, I couldn't help myself. I turned, my eyes drawn to one of the broken windows on the second floor. The figure stood there, framed by the shattered glass. It was perfectly still, its form partially obscured by the darkness. Yet its gaze, though featureless, was unmistakable, locked onto me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. I stared back, frozen in place, unable to look away. It didn't move, didn't react, but the silent connection between us was palpable, as though it were daring me to return. Finally, I forced myself to turn away, stumbling through the gap in the fence and onto the street beyond. The night air felt colder now, sharper, but it carried a faint sense of relief. The man approached me just as I was leaving the coffee shop. He was tall, clean-cut, with an authoritative air that made me stop in my tracks. His tone was calm but firm, and the badge clipped to his belt added an undeniable weight to his words. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady. "Are you protagonist's name? I need a moment of your time." I nodded hesitantly. He explained that he was investigating an urgent matter involving something I might have unknowingly been a part of, a missing person last seen in the area. His story was detailed, convincing, and I found myself agreeing to accompany him to a nearby location where he claimed we could clarify things. Despite his professional demeanor, something about the interaction gnawed at me. His explanations were just a little too polished, his urgency slightly too rehearsed. But I reasoned that there was no harm in cooperating. After all, he seemed legitimate, and refusing might make me look guilty of something I hadn't done. We drove in silence, the scenery outside becoming increasingly desolate. The city gave way to empty fields, then to a dense stretch of forest. My unease grew with every mile, but when I glanced at him, his expression betrayed nothing. He was calm, focused, too focused. When we arrived, the location was not what I expected. It wasn't an official building or a meeting point. It was an old, run-down cabin nestled deep in the woods. My chest tightened as I stepped out of the car. "This way," he said, his tone sharper now. He motioned toward the cabin, and I followed, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. The cabin's interior was sparse and cold, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and rot. My footsteps creaked loudly on the uneven floorboards as I stepped inside, every sound amplified by the oppressive silence. There were no signs of anyone else, no indication of an ongoing investigation, just emptiness. He closed the door behind us with a heavy thud, and I realized how alone I was. My phone, my first instinct, was useless. There was no signal out here. I hadn't told anyone where I was going, assuming it would be a short detour. "Wait here," he said, his voice flat. He moved toward a back room, shutting the door behind him. The sound of a lock clicking into place echoed ominously. I stood frozen, my mind racing. Something was wrong. I glanced around the room, taking in every detail, the boarded-up windows, the lack of any official equipment or files. This wasn't a safe space. It was a trap. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I tried the door, but it didn't budge. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind. Why had I trusted him, and what was he planning to do? The door opened suddenly, and he reappeared, his expression colder than before. He no longer carried the pretense of authority. The professional demeanor had melted away, replaced by something predatory. "Here's the deal," he said, stepping closer. "You're going to stay put until I say otherwise." I tried to speak, to question him, but he cut me off with a glare that froze the words in my throat. He didn't have to say it outright. I could see it in his posture, in the way he stood between me and the exit. I wasn't going anywhere unless he allowed it. He moved to a corner of the room, rummaging through a bag I hadn't noticed before. I took the moment to scan the cabin more thoroughly, searching for anything that might help me. My eyes landed on a loose board in the floor near the far wall. He turned back toward me, and I quickly averted my gaze, pretending to stare at the empty fireplace. He didn't seem to notice. My mind raced, formulating a plan. If I could distract him, even for a moment, I might have a chance to escape. The opportunity came when he stepped outside, muttering about needing something from the car. The door shut behind him, and I didn't waste a second. I darted to the loose floorboard, prying it up with my hands. Beneath it was a narrow crawl space, just wide enough for me to slip through. I climbed down, my movements frantic but quiet, trying to suppress the panic rising in my chest. The crawl space led to a small opening on the side of the cabin, partially hidden by overgrown weeds. I pushed through, my body scraping against the rough wood as I emerged into the cold, open air. The forest loomed around me, dark and endless. I didn't know where I was going, but anywhere was better than here. I sprinted into the trees, the sound of my breathing loud in the stillness. Behind me, I heard the cabin door slam open, followed by a furious shout. He had noticed my escape. His footsteps crashed through the underbrush, growing louder as he closed the distance. The chase was on. The forest seemed to close in around me as I ran, branches clawing at my clothes and the uneven ground threatening to trip me with every step. My breath came in ragged gasps, each inhalation burning my lungs, but I didn't dare stop. The sound of his pursuit was unmistakable, heavy, deliberate, relentless. I dodged between trees, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. The underbrush slowed me, twigs snapping underfoot and betraying my location. His shouts rang out behind me, angry and taunting, though his exact words were lost in the pounding of my pulse. Every instinct screamed at me to stay quiet, but panic clouded my judgment. I stumbled over a fallen log, barely catching myself before hitting the ground. The noise felt deafening, and I could hear his footsteps drawing closer. I veered to the left, hoping to lose him in the thicker part of the forest. The trees grew denser, their shadows deeper, creating a maze of obstacles. I tried to move silently, but every step seemed to betray me. My flashlight was gone, left behind in the cabin, and the encroaching darkness made it harder to navigate. Suddenly, his voice was closer, dangerously near. "You can't hide forever," he called, his tone laced with cruel amusement. "I'll find you." I crouched low behind a cluster of bushes, pressing myself into the earth. My heart thudded so loudly I was certain he could hear it. The sound of his footsteps slowed, each one deliberate as he searched the area. I held my breath, willing myself to become invisible. He moved past me, his silhouette briefly illuminated by a sliver of moonlight. I waited until the sound of his steps faded before daring to move again. I continued deeper into the forest, my mind racing for a plan. The terrain was uneven, riddled with roots and jagged rocks, but it offered potential advantages if I could use it right. Spotting a cluster of large boulders, I climbed onto them, hoping to obscure my trail. From there, I grabbed a loose branch and threw it into the underbrush ahead, creating a noise to mislead him. The sound of snapping twigs echoed through the trees, and moments later, his footsteps shifted in that direction. I doubled back, keeping low and moving as quickly as I dared. The forest seemed endless, but I knew I couldn't keep running indefinitely. My legs ached, and my energy was waning, but fear kept me moving. At one point, I came across a shallow stream. The water was icy, shocking against my skin as I waded through it, but it offered a chance to mask my scent and footprints. I followed the stream for as long as I could, hoping it would make it harder for him to track me. Behind me, I heard a faint splash. He had found the stream. My chest tightened as I scrambled up the bank, pushing myself into another dense thicket of trees. My hands trembled as I picked up a heavy rock, holding it tightly in case I needed to defend myself. The forest opened up suddenly, revealing a steep incline that led to a narrow dirt road below. Relief flooded me. I was closer to escape, but the incline was treacherous, and I didn't have time to find a safer path. I slid down the slope, my hands and knees scraping against the rocky ground. Behind me, his voice echoed through the trees, louder and angrier. He had spotted me. Reaching the road, I stumbled to my feet, my body screaming in protest. The forest was still thick on either side, offering no clear direction. I ran blindly, my vision blurred by exhaustion and fear. Ahead, I saw headlights, distant but unmistakable. A car was approaching. My heart leapt as I ran toward the light, waving my arms frantically. but his footsteps were right behind me. I could feel his presence, hear his ragged breaths as he closed in. I pushed myself harder, the adrenaline drowning out the pain. As the car neared, I threw myself into the middle of the road, forcing the driver to slam on the brakes. The tires screeched and the vehicle skidded to a halt mere feet from me. The driver, a stunned older man, stared at me as I pounded on the hood, shouting for help. I didn't have time to explain, only motioning for him to unlock the door. He hesitated, but the desperation in my voice must have convinced him. I climbed into the passenger seat, locking the door behind me just as the man burst from the edge of the forest. His face was twisted with fury, his hands slamming against the car window as he shouted obscenities. "Drive!" I yelled. The driver didn't need further prompting. He hit the gas, and the car sped down the road, leaving the man behind in a cloud of dust. For the first time in what felt like hours, I allowed myself to breathe. My body sagged against the seat, every muscle trembling with exhaustion. The driver asked what had happened, but I couldn't find the words to explain. By the time we reached a more populated area, the man was long gone. I thanked the driver and assured him I would be fine, though my hands still shook as I pulled out my phone to call someone, anyone, for support. The navigation app had always been reliable, guiding me through unfamiliar roads without fail. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I trusted it once more, following its directions as it led me away from the highway and onto a narrower, quieter road. The destination wasn't far, and I assumed this was just a shortcut. But the road grew narrower with each passing mile, the surroundings shifting from suburban sprawl to dense, shadowy wilderness. The trees on either side seemed to close in, their gnarled branches forming an oppressive canopy overhead. The app's cheerful voice occasionally chimed in, directing me further into the remote area, though something about its timing felt off. I noticed the road signs becoming sparse, their lettering faded and unhelpful. The pavement beneath the tires gave way to uneven gravel, jarring the car with every bump. The uneasy feeling in my chest grew stronger, but I dismissed it. The app knew the way. It always did. As twilight deepened into night, the app suddenly announced rerouting, its cheerful tone now grating against my nerves. The map shifted, the blue line zigzagging aimlessly before freezing altogether. My phone displayed an error message, no signal. I pulled over, staring at the screen in disbelief. The signal bars were gone, and the map was blank, except for a small pin marking my last known location. The realization hit me like a cold wave. I was completely alone in an unknown area, with no way to navigate back. I tried retracing my route, turning the car around to head back the way I'd come. But the dense forest looked identical in every direction, and without the app's guidance, I couldn't tell if I was making progress or going deeper into nowhere. The sky darkened rapidly, the last traces of sunlight swallowed by the horizon. I glanced at the gas gauge. It was low, but not dangerously so. Driving aimlessly seemed like a poor choice, so I pulled over to the side of the road, parking in a small clearing. I decided to wait until morning when the daylight might help me get my bearings. The air was unnervingly still as I cut the engine, plunging the surroundings into silence. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the only sounds coming from the faint creaks of the cooling car and my own nervous breathing. I locked the doors, checking each one twice before leaning back in my seat. The interior of the car felt suffocating, the shadows outside pressing against the windows. My phone was useless without a signal, but I kept it on anyway, its dim light a small comfort against the encroaching darkness. Sleep came reluctantly, my mind replaying the unsettling events of the evening. The quiet was oppressive, yet I told myself it was better than wandering blindly in the night. At least in the car I was safe, or so I thought. The first sound woke me sometime after midnight, a faint whisper that seemed to come from the woods. I sat upright, straining to hear through the fog of sleep. It was so quiet that I almost dismissed it as my imagination. But then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, crunching on the gravel around the car. My pulse quickened as I reached for my phone, using its screen to illuminate the dark interior. I scanned the windows, but the beams of light revealed nothing outside. The footsteps circled slowly, methodically, each crunch sending a shiver down my spine. I locked the doors again, though I knew they were already secure. My eyes darted from window to window, expecting to see a face pressed against the glass or a shadow moving just beyond the faint glow of the moonlight. But there was nothing, just the sounds of movement outside and the whispers, faint and incomprehensible, brushing against the edges of my hearing. I turned on the car's interior lights, hoping to scare off whatever or whoever was out there. The footsteps paused for a moment, the sudden stillness more terrifying than the noise had been. Then they resumed, this time heavier, closer. Panic gripped me as I realized I couldn't stay there any longer. Whatever was outside wasn't leaving, and the thought of sitting in the car, helpless, was unbearable. I started the car, the engine roaring to life and breaking the oppressive silence. The sound seemed to echo through the forest, and for a brief moment, everything outside went still. I flicked on the headlights, illuminating the narrow road ahead. The beams cut through the darkness, revealing a path hemmed in by dense trees. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel, hesitating for only a moment before pressing the gas. The car rolled forward, its tires crunching on the gravel as I squinted at the road ahead, trying to make sense of the jagged turns and uneven surface. My phone sat useless in the passenger seat, its blank map a reminder of how alone I was. As the car picked up speed, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing me. The whispers had stopped, but the sense of being watched hadn't. Every shadow seemed alive, every flicker of movement at the edge of my vision a potential threat. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away from that spot. The road seemed endless, twisting and turning through the dense forest. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out the hum of the engine. Then I saw it, the figure in the middle of the road. It stood perfectly still, illuminated by the high beams, a dark silhouette against the pale gravel road. The figure was unnervingly human in shape, but its features were indistinct, swallowed by the shadows. My foot slammed on the brake, the car skidding to a halt just feet away. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, all I could do was stare, my heart pounding as my mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, not an inch, not a twitch. It simply stood there, facing me, its presence heavy and oppressive. The seconds stretched unbearably. My headlights cast long, stark shadows into the surrounding trees, and yet the figure seemed untouched by the light, as if it absorbed the beams rather than reflecting them. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the darkness, a tree trunk or a shadow playing tricks on my tired mind. But deep down, I knew better. I reached for the gear shift, my movements slow and deliberate. My hands trembled as I shifted into reverse, my eyes never leaving the figure. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it moved. Not toward me, but sideways, stepping silently into the forest. It was gone in an instant, swallowed by the darkness, leaving no trace it had ever been there. My chest tightened as I stared into the empty road, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The oppressive silence returned, heavier than before. I couldn't sit there any longer. I pressed the gas, forcing the car forward, my hands shaking as I steered around the spot where the figure had stood. The road stretched endlessly ahead, twisting and turning through the dense forest. Every shadow felt alive, every flicker of movement a potential threat. My headlights swept across the trees, casting eerie shapes that seemed to shift and dance as I sped past. My thoughts were a chaotic swirl. Who or what had I seen? The way it stood, the deliberate nature of its movements, defied any rational explanation. My body ached with tension, my muscles stiff as I gripped the wheel tighter than necessary. Then, in the rearview mirror, I saw a flash of movement. It was quick, just a fleeting blur in the darkness, but it was enough to send a surge of panic through me. I pressed harder on the gas, the car jolting over the uneven road, as I fought to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was out there. The forest seemed to close in around me, the road narrowing until it felt like a tunnel of shadows. My peripheral vision caught flickers of movement, branches swaying, shapes darting between trees. But when I turned my head, there was nothing there. My mind raced with fear and exhaustion, struggling to separate reality from paranoia. The oppressive feeling of being watched grew stronger, a weight that pressed down on me with every mile. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out the hum of the engine. I couldn't shake the sense that something or someone was still following me. After what felt like an eternity, the road began to widen. The dense forest gave way to open fields, the trees thinning until I could see the faint glow of the horizon in the distance. My breath hitched as a single bar of cell signal flickered onto my phone screen. I slowed the car just enough to refresh the navigation app, relief washing over me as it loaded a new route. The familiar blue line reappeared, guiding me back toward civilization. I followed it without hesitation, my eyes flicking constantly between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. The fear didn't fade, even as the signs of life grew closer. Streetlights appeared in the distance, their orange glow a beacon of safety, yet my body remained tense. I kept expecting the figure to reappear, to emerge from the shadows and block the road once more, but the road ahead stayed clear. Finally, I saw the lights of a small gas station. It was closed, but the sight of it, a man-made structure in the middle of the wilderness, brought a small measure of comfort. I pulled into the parking lot, my hands trembling as I turned off the engine. The gravel crunched under the tires as I turned into the long driveway leading to the country house. The surrounding forest stretched endlessly, the sunlight filtering through a canopy of golden leaves. The house itself stood at the end of the path, its wooden exterior blending with the rustic charm of the countryside. It was exactly how my friend Daniel had described it, a peaceful retreat far from the chaos of the city. Daniel greeted me at the porch, his smile warm but fleeting. He seemed preoccupied, his eyes darting toward the door as though expecting someone else to emerge. I brushed it off, assuming he was distracted by the logistics of hosting. He ushered me inside, the scent of pine and something faintly musty filling the air. The house was cozy yet spacious, with antique furniture and shelves lined with books that gave it a lived-in character. "You'll love it here," Daniel said, though his voice lacked enthusiasm. He gestured to the guest room at the end of the hall. "Make yourself comfortable. It's quiet, perfect for unwinding." I unpacked, noticing small quirks about the house, a door at the end of the hallway with a padlock, and a corner of the basement blocked off by an old wooden partition. The place seemed well kept, yet these areas hinted at something concealed. When I asked Daniel about the locked door, he shrugged it off. "Just storage," he said quickly, changing the subject. That evening, we sat by the fireplace, the crackle of burning wood punctuating the silence. Daniel talked about his work and how much he enjoyed the solitude here, but his words felt rehearsed, like he was keeping the real reason for his isolation to himself. I didn't press, though a faint unease lingered as I retired for the night. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the wooden beams as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, but it was a different sound that woke me, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from within the house. I sat up, my heart beating faster than I wanted to admit. The tapping wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, like someone knocking gently against the wall. I opened the door to the hallway, the dim light from a single wall sconce casting long shadows. The noise seemed to come from the direction of the locked door. I crept closer, my bare feet silent on the floorboards, but as I neared the door, the sound stopped abruptly. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for it to return. It didn't. Back in my room, I tried to dismiss it as the house settling or a rodent scurrying through the walls. When I mentioned it to Daniel over breakfast, he waved it off with a laugh. "This place makes strange noises. You'll get used to it." His reaction felt too casual, almost rehearsed. Something about it didn't sit right, but I let it go, not wanting to seem paranoid. Over the next day, I began noticing patterns in Daniel's movements. He avoided certain parts of the house, never lingering near the locked door or the basement partition. It became a habit of mine to watch him, noting how he always seemed to redirect attention away from those areas whenever we walked by them. At lunch, I asked about the house's history. Daniel stiffened, his cheerful demeanor fading for a moment. "It's old," he said curtly, not offering more. When I pressed for details, he abruptly changed the subject to an upcoming renovation project. The locked door became an obsession. I imagined what could be behind it, old furniture, maybe forgotten family heirlooms. But then why the padlock? The more I thought about it, the less the storage explanation made sense. By the third day, Daniel's behavior began to shift. His responses to my questions became clipped, his gestures more abrupt. He would disappear for hours without explanation, returning with vague comments about running errands despite being miles from any town. That evening, as we sat for dinner, I noticed he was quieter than usual. He barely touched his food, his eyes fixed on the fireplace. I decided to bring up the noises again, mentioning that I'd heard something similar the previous night. This time, his reaction wasn't casual, it was defensive. "Old houses make sounds," he snapped, his tone sharp enough to cut through the air. "You're imagining things." His response startled me. I dropped the subject, but the atmosphere had shifted. As I went to bed that night, I felt a heaviness in the house, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. When the noises started again, louder this time, I knew I wasn't imagining anything. The following morning, I resolved to satisfy my growing suspicions. Daniel had left early, muttering something about needing to handle a delivery. I didn't question him, glad for the time alone to explore. I started with the locked door. My fingers brushed the cold padlock as I tried to jiggle it, but it held firm. Searching nearby drawers and cabinets, I came across nothing that seemed out of place until I spotted a small key hidden beneath a stack of faded letters in a side table. It didn't match the padlock, but looked like it belonged to something else, perhaps in the basement. The basement was colder than I expected, the smell of damp wood and mildew heavy in the air. The partition that had caught my attention earlier stood in one corner, its wooden planks weathered and uneven. Using the key, I opened a small locked chest nearby, only to find an assortment of seemingly mundane objects, old tools, a dusty ledger, and photographs of people I didn't recognize. But one thing stood out, a rusted chain that was far too heavy to be used for decoration. Before I could inspect further, I heard the faint hum of an engine outside. Panic set in as I scrambled to replace everything exactly as I'd found it. Daniel was back earlier than I anticipated. I barely made it upstairs in time, my heart pounding as I pretended to read a book when he walked in. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. I nodded, but his eyes lingered on me too long, and I knew he suspected something. The tension between us grew unbearable. Daniel became irritable, snapping over small things like an unwashed coffee cup or a misplaced magazine. He seemed to hover around me, as though trying to catch me in the act of something. His once friendly demeanor had morphed into something darker, his presence suffocating. I decided to act as though nothing was wrong, keeping to myself and avoiding any questions about the house. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, even when he wasn't in the room. That night, the locked door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar. A sliver of darkness peeked through, daring me to investigate. I approached cautiously, but as I reached for the doorknob, Daniel's voice boomed behind me. "What are you doing?" he demanded. I turned to find him standing at the other end of the hallway, his face a mixture of anger and something else, fear. I stammered an excuse about hearing noises again, but he cut me off. "Stay out of there," he said, his voice low and cold. "You're imagining things. Go to bed." I obeyed, retreating to my room, but I didn't sleep. I couldn't. By the next morning, I'd made my decision. I couldn't stay another day in that house. Something was deeply wrong, and I wasn't willing to wait and find out what it was. I packed my belongings quietly, stuffing them into my bag as quickly as I could. The house felt heavier, as though it knew I was leaving. As I stepped into the hallway, I froze. Daniel was standing by the front door, blocking my exit. His face was calm, but his posture was rigid. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice devoid of warmth. I mumbled an excuse about needing to get back to work, but he didn't move. For a moment I thought he wouldn't let me leave. The silence stretched on, oppressive and thick, until he finally stepped aside. "Drive safely," he said, his tone flat. I didn't look back as I hurried to my car. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, but I managed to start the engine and drive away. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing in the driveway watching me leave, but the road behind me was empty.